The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone above the oncology ward at Sacred Heart Hospital, and Natalie Hayes moved through them like she was counting steps to a landing zone. 1 foot. 2 foot. The slight limp in her left leg barely registered anymore, and not to anyone watching, anyway. 3 years of 12-hour shifts had taught her how to make the limp disappear into muscle memory, the same way she'd learned to make everything else disappear. The scar tissue along her calf, still pinkish under the compression sleeve. The way her hands sometimes moved faster than they should, muscle memory from a different life in a different desert. The navy jacket hanging in her locker with a faded patch sewn inside the lining, the kind of patch that got you killed if the wrong people knew you wore it. Jacksonville's humidity pressed against the hospital's concrete bones, and the antiseptic smell mixed with floor wax in a way that somehow made mornings feel survivable. Natalie adjusted the 4-line on bed 412, a 73-year-old named Margaret with stage 4 lymphoma and a daughter who never visited. The older woman's hand trembled as Natalie checked the flow rate, and without being asked, Natalie pressed her palm against Margaret's forehead, cool, steady, the way a mother's hand should feel. 2 seconds. That's all Margaret needed. Then Natalie was moving again, her mind already 3 patients ahead, already knowing that bed 407 would need another blanket in 20 minutes, that the resident on 409 had ordered the wrong antibiotic and nobody had caught it yet. She caught it in 4 seconds flat. Natalie intercepted Dr. Reeves at the medication cart, her voice low and careful the way she'd learned to pitch it, deferential, almost apologetic, never accusatory. "Doctor, I think that's levofloxacin for 409. Patient's penicillin allergic." The chart flagged it red. Dr. Reeves looked up from the 4 bag like he'd been interrupted mid-thought, irritation flickering across his face before he saw the chart. Before he saw he was wrong. He corrected it without thanking her. This was normal. Natalie expected nothing else. By 10 o'clock, she'd already prevented 2 medication errors, calmed a panicked teenager on the surgical floor who'd woken up confused from anesthesia, just 2 words, "You're okay," delivered with the kind of certainty that made people believe it, and placed an EKG on an 86-year-old whose son had been arguing with the nurses about discharge timing. The son's voice had been getting louder. Natalie listened to the old man's heart rhythm with the stethoscope, then looked at the son and said, "Arrhythmia. He needs another day." The son sat down. His father's hand found hers. She squeezed it once and moved on. What nobody at Sacred Heart knew was that Natalie Hayes had commanded a Special Forces medical unit in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province. That she'd trained soldiers to save lives under mortar fire. That her hands had performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife because there was no time for surgical instruments and the man would die anyway without her. That she'd taken shrapnel the size of her thumbnail through her left calf while amputating the leg of a sergeant who'd stepped on an IED, and she'd kept working because the tourniquet wasn't tight enough and he was still bleeding out. That she'd come home with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a limp that would never go away, and she'd decided in a hospital parking lot at 3 in the morning that the Natalie Hayes who wore a uniform was dead, and the Natalie Hayes who wore scrubs would be quiet enough to disappear. The thing about disappearing was that it worked, right up until it didn't. Corporal Davis arrived in the emergency department at 10:16 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, brought in by Jacksonville Fire and Rescue after he'd collapsed outside a VA clinic. He was mute, had been mute for 2 years following whatever happened in his head while he was deployed, but his body was screaming in a language Natalie recognized the moment she saw him. His pupils were blown wide like black saucers. His jaw was locked so tight the paramedics said he'd refused oxygen, wouldn't let anyone touch him. His breathing came in short, sharp bursts, like his lungs didn't trust the air. His hands kept clenching and unclenching into fists. His eyes were scanning the room for exits, for threats, for the thing that was about to kill him. Natalie knew that look because she'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers choking on their own blood in the dust. She'd seen it in the mirror for 6 months after she came home. The paramedics wheeled Davis into Trauma Bay 4, and Dr. Caldwell arrived 30 seconds later, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum in that specific rhythm that meant he was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else, already seeing the problem and solving it without actually looking at the patient yet. He was tall, impeccably groomed, the kind of man who used aftershave like a weapon, His tie was silk. His watch cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. He'd been chief of surgery at Sacred Heart for 16 years, which meant he'd spent 16 years building a world where his word was law and his authority was unquestionable. He ran the ER like a kingdom, kept his donors happy with short wait times and impressive patient outcomes, kept his staff in line with a combination of competence and casual cruelty that made people afraid to question him. "What do we have?" Caldwell's voice moved through the bay like a command. The paramedic rattled off vitals: BP 158/92, heart rate 142, respiratory rate 28 and shallow, no visible trauma, collapsed at civilian facility, unresponsive to standard assessment. The paramedic said unresponsive, but what he meant was Davis was locked inside himself, unreachable, the panic in his body so complete that it had shut down language. Natalie was already moving. She was already logging the signs, the way Davis's hands were shaking, the way his eyes were jerking around the room like they were tracking something invisible, the way his chest was heaving like he was drowning in air. This wasn't medical. This was the physical architecture of trauma. This was a man having a catastrophic panic attack, and what Davis needed wasn't sedation. What Davis needed was someone to tell him he was safe. Anxiety attack, Caldwell announced, the decision already made before he'd even looked at the patient. Sedate him. 5 milligrams midazolam 4. Get him stable and move him to psychiatric observation. The room went quiet in that specific way that happens when someone in authority has just said the wrong thing but nobody's going to contradict them. The nurses were already preparing the injection. The resident was already writing the order. Natalie watched it happen like watching a car move toward a cliff, and she couldn't just watch. She couldn't. Not with those eyes. Not with that panic in his chest that she recognized the way you recognize your own heartbeat. She stepped forward. Her voice came out quiet, careful, the way she'd learned to speak to authority over 3 years of being invisible. "Doctor, I think we should do a psychiatric assessment before sedation. His symptoms suggest acute trauma response, not primary anxiety. The midazolam might suppress his ability to communicate his baseline symptoms, and if there's an underlying neurological component." "He's mute," Caldwell said, his eyes not moving from the chart in his hand. "He communicates nothing. The sedation will prevent agitation and allow for a proper workup." "Respectfully, sir, the agitation might be protective. If he's in acute distress from past trauma." Caldwell's jaw tightened. His eyes lifted from the chart and found her over the top of his glasses, and in that single glance, Natalie watched something shift in the room. She watched him recognize her as a problem. She watched him decide something. "The patient receives 5 milligrams of midazolam, Hayes." "That's an order." He said her last name the way you'd say the name of a tool that had malfunctioned. The room moved with his instructions, bodies turning toward medications and 4 pumps, the machinery of institutional authority grinding forward. And Natalie stood there for one more second, watching Davis's eyes, watching the panic in them, watching the man's hands shake like he was back in the desert where whatever had broken his voice had happened, and she made a choice that would end her career in 72 hours. She didn't move toward the medications. She moved toward the patient. The overhead speaker crackled at 7:15 in the morning, cutting through the nurses' station where 20 staff members were checking assignments, reviewing charts, pulling medications. The voice emerged flat and mechanical, the kind of announcement that stops people mid-breath. "Paging Nightingale Natalie to the supply room." Nightingale Natalie to supplies. The room froze. Then laughter, not loud, but present, rippling from resident to tech to the orderlies refilling the ice machine. Natalie didn't look up from the medication cart where she was documenting a patient's blood pressure. Her fingers continued their work, steady as surgical instruments. One measured breath. That's all she allowed herself. The name, Nightingale Natalie, hung in the air like a corrosive gas, and she watched Dr. Caldwell from the corner of her vision, arms crossed against his chest at the main desk, watching her face the way a surgeon watches a wound response to antiseptic. Waiting to see if she'd react. Waiting to see if she'd break. She didn't. She set down her pen with precision, the click of ballpoint on clipboard the only sound she made, and walked toward the supply room. The nurse's station resumed its chaos behind her, phones ringing, monitors beeping, the ambient noise of a hospital pretending nothing had happened, but the laughter lingered. The supply room door was narrow, the kind that closes with a soft hydraulic hiss, and Caldwell was already inside when she crossed the threshold. He'd followed her. The realization came without fear, only clarity. The room smelled of antiseptic and cardboard, shelves stacked 8 feet high with gauze rolls, for bags, trauma shears, the inventory of keeping people alive. The fluorescent panel overhead buzzed with the steady hum of electricity, casting everything in clinical white. Caldwell positioned himself between her and the exit, not blocking it exactly, but close enough that she'd have to brush past him to leave. He was tall, built like a man who'd once played football and spent the years since translating that physical authority into something harder, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, as if his anger had physical weight. "You questioned my sedation protocol in front of my residents this morning." His voice didn't rise. That was worse than shouting. It was the calm of a man accustomed to obedience, the tone of someone who'd never had to repeat himself. "You know what that is? Insubordination. And you know what insubordination costs in this hospital." He moved closer, backing her against the metal shelving that held for solution bottles, the cold edge pressing against her spine. "Your job. Your license. Your future. Every single one of them gone. You're a floor nurse, Miss Hayes. Act like one." The shelving rattled slightly when her back touched it. She could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, the kind designed to announce arrival, and beneath it, something else. Coffee and the faint mineral scent of stress sweat. His face was inches from hers now, and what struck her wasn't the threat. It was the need behind it. He was angry because he felt challenged. And challenged men, in her experience, were dangerous. One breath. That's all she let herself take before responding. Measured. Level. The kind of breath that came from deep training, from years of keeping her nervous system in check while people screamed around her. A single tear escaped, not from fear, but from the sheer compression of restraint, the pressure of holding still when her military instincts were screaming to move, to act, to neutralize the threat. She didn't try to hide it. She watched his eyes track the tear as it ran down her cheek, watched his expression shift, anticipating the breakdown he was manufactured to produce. Then she wiped it away slowly, deliberately, without breaking eye contact. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for him to realize she wasn't breaking. Humiliating people doesn't make you a better doctor, Dr. Caldwell. Her voice had dropped an octave, the way it did when she was translating between languages she'd learned in the desert, not from anger, but from a kind of operational calm. "It just makes you a smaller man." He stepped back. Not much. Inches. But it was enough. His jaw clenched, a muscle working along the hinge of his teeth, and for a moment something flickered across his face, the recognition that he'd misjudged her. That whatever he'd expected from a floor nurse backing against medical supply shelves, this wasn't it. He turned and left without another word, the door closing with that same hydraulic hiss. Natalie stood motionless for 30 seconds, her hands still at her sides, before her fingers finally released the tension they'd been holding. The shelving had left an impression on her spine, a line of pressure marks that she could feel through her scrubs. She pressed her palm against one of those marks, and her breath came back to normal, the way it always did. The way it had to. The parking lot was asphalt still warm from the morning sun, lined with vehicles that belonged to the day shift. Natalie was clocking out when she saw the night shift arriving, 6 nurses pulling into designated spaces, their bags slung over shoulders, ready for the 12 hours ahead. And there was Caldwell, standing beside his Mercedes, black, pristine, the kind of car that announced what he believed about himself, waiting for her like he'd timed it. Like he'd planned for witnesses. Natalie. Not Miss Hayes this time. The informality was its own weapon. Effective immediately, you're stripped of your lead nurse duties. You'll be covering bedpans and vitals until you learn your place in the hierarchy. We clear. The night shift slowed as they approached the entrance, and Natalie could feel their attention without looking, the weight of their witnessing. This was the point, not privacy, but audience. Humiliation required witnesses. He was teaching the hospital a lesson, using her as the medium. She stood in what she'd learned to call quiet dignity, the posture of someone who'd already survived worse than losing a title. One tear escaped, she let it fall this time, didn't wipe it away immediately. Let him see it. Let the night shift see it. Let them all believe he'd accomplished something. Then she wiped her face with one slow gesture and met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Is that all, Doctor?" The question was formulated to require no answer, and she didn't wait for one. She walked past him toward the entrance, past the 6 nurses who'd stopped to watch, their expressions uncertain, as if they were witnessing something they didn't have a framework for. A woman being dismantled in real time, and she'd responded like she was thanking him for the information. Inside, Sacred Heart's corridors were already shifting into night mode, fewer people, different energy, the building's metabolism slowing. But Natalie didn't go home. She clocked back in and reported to her new assignment, bedpan rounds, vitals checks, the entry-level tasks she'd spent 3 years earning the right to delegate. The fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floors, creating a corridor of white that seemed to stretch infinitely ahead of her. Her legs moved through it without her conscious instruction, muscle memory, the operational autopilot that had served her in other hospitals, in other countries, under different kinds of fire. The night shift staff watched her work without commenting, the way people watch someone after a public defeat. There was pity there, and confusion, and a question hanging unspoken in the hallway: who was this woman who'd absorbed humiliation without breaking, without even fighting back? Room 304 had a 73-year-old man post-appendectomy, and she changed his bedpan with the same precision she would have used for anything else. Room 306 needed vitals checked at 9:40 p.m., blood pressure 148/82, heart rate 76, temperature normal. She documented everything, her handwriting steady as someone writing surgical notes under fire. The weight of the demotion was real, the loss of authority, the systematic dismantling, but it was also tactical. Caldwell wasn't finished with her. This was stage 2. He'd tested her composure with public mockery and physical intimidation. Now he was establishing dominance through institutional control, restricting her scope, reducing her to the smallest possible footprint. But he'd made a mistake. He'd assumed that someone like her, hidden beneath scrubs, diminished to appear manageable, would actually feel smaller when stripped of a title. The monitors on the 3rd floor sang their constant electronic song as midnight approached, that strange hospital music of beeping and hissing, the ventilators and 4 pumps maintaining the boundary between living and not. Natalie moved through it like she'd always existed in that space, the one between visibility and invisibility, where the real work happened. At 1:30 a.m., the emergency department sent up a trauma alert. Incoming, male patient, acute respiratory distress, presenting in the ER within minutes. She heard the announcement and felt her body respond before her conscious mind caught up. The alert tone activated something primal in her nervous system, a frequency she'd been trained to recognize as the sound of something coming unraveled. She moved toward the elevators without being asked, muscle memory taking over, the way it did when danger announced itself through speakers. But Caldwell's voice reached her before the doors opened. "Miss Hayes, you're on bedpans tonight. Someone else can assist with trauma." He was standing at the nurse's station, watching her, and she understood in that moment what he was doing. He was cutting her off from the patient. From any patient who might need the kind of competence she carried. He was reducing her to the smallest possible utility, testing whether she'd accept it, whether the public humiliation had actually worked. She stopped at the elevator doors and turned to face him. The hallway was empty except for the night staff, most of whom had returned to their stations. "Understood, Doctor." Her voice was flat, professional, the voice of someone accepting an assignment they didn't agree with but wouldn't challenge. She turned back to room 308, where a patient with a hip replacement was requesting pain medication, and she administered it with the same care she would have applied to anything else. But her eyes tracked the elevator doors as they opened and closed, carrying the other nurses downward toward whatever was arriving in the emergency department. 20 minutes after Caldwell adjusted Davis's sedative drip upward with a smirk that suggested competence he didn't actually possess, the monitor's rhythm changed. Not gradually. Not with warning. The cardiac pattern flickered once, then dissolved into the frantic screaming of a code blue alarm that split the fourth floor like a gunshot through glass. Natalie was in room 312, adjusting a post-op patient's compression sleeve, when the sound hit. She knew that alarm. Not the noise itself, plenty of nurses heard code blues, but the specific register of it, the way her nervous system responded to it like a claymore mine detonating in adjacent terrain. Her hand stilled. Her breathing synchronized. And she was moving before conscious thought caught up, muscle memory recognizing the signature of a man dying. Room 308 was 40 feet down the corridor. She covered it in 8 seconds flat, pushing past 2 residents who were still processing what the alarm meant. The door opened and the smell hit her first, antiseptic mixing with something darker, the copper penny scent of emergency sweat, and underneath it all, the acrid ghost of whatever sedative Caldwell had pumped into Davis's for line. Davis was convulsing. Not the controlled seizure pattern from a documented epilepsy, this was violent, uncoordinated, his entire body jackknifing against the bed rails like electricity was running through him. His jaw was locked so tight his teeth were grinding audibly, and his tongue, his tongue was swollen backward, blocking the space where air was supposed to travel. His skin had gone the color of storm clouds. His eyes were rolled so far back only the whites showed, the same expression she'd seen on Private Torres in the dust outside Sangin when shrapnel tore through his neck and he couldn't breathe, couldn't call for help, couldn't do anything but suffocate while conscious. Seizure activity, someone said, one of the residents, voice climbing toward panic. We need to get the intubation kit, Caldwell's voice cut through, exactly 2 seconds too late. He stood in the doorway, still holding his pocket-sized protocol reference card like it was a compass that would guide him through any crisis. His eyes moved across Davis's convulsing form with the careful deliberation of someone consulting an instruction manual. This was not a man who'd seen combat medical emergencies. This was a man who'd spent his career in controlled environments where protocols worked and hierarchy was never questioned. Natalie moved past him without a word, no permission asked, no verbal formality wasted. Her hands were already reaching toward the crash cart as Caldwell continued speaking to no one in particular, his words floating uselessly into the chaos. We'll need to sedate him further before attempting intubation. His jaw is locked. We'll follow the respiratory distress protocol. More sedation, then. Davis's oxygen saturation was dropping in real time. The monitor displayed it like a countdown, 92. 87, 81. Each number a second closer to permanent brain damage, each second a choice that was being made for him by a man reading from a card instead of seeing what was actually happening. Natalie's hand closed around the surgical scalpel from the crash cart. The handle was familiar, not the exact model she'd used in field hospitals, but similar enough that her fingers adjusted instinctively. The weight was right. The balance was right. And the tactical picture was crystalline, locked airway, swelling tissue, sedative deepening the problem instead of solving it, and approximately 90 seconds before Davis's brain started dying. Doctor, he needs an emergency airway now, she said. Her voice was flat. Operational. The voice of someone who'd made these decisions while explosions rocked the compound around her. Caldwell looked up from his protocol card, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, his institutional authority flickered. Here was a nurse, speaking to him not in deference but in the measured tone of a peer delivering critical information. Here was someone who looked at a dying patient and didn't freeze. Absolutely not. We follow protocol, Caldwell said, and the words came out with the precision of someone reading from a script he'd never deviated from. We're going to sedate him further, then attempt intubation once. Natalie was already moving. Her body didn't wait for permission. It responded to the data, 78% oxygen saturation, airway compromise, time pressure, and a patient whose PTSD-locked jaw had created a surgical emergency. The scalpel entered her hand like an extension of her intention, and her other hand found Davis's neck, one finger locating the cricoid cartilage, the landscape of his anatomy responding to her touch like a map she'd studied 1,000 times under far worse conditions. The cricothyrotomy took 4 seconds. 1 incision through the skin and fascial layers, a horizontal cut through the membrane between cartilages, and the airway opened like a door. Air rushed in. Davis's lungs filled. His oxygen saturation climbed, 82, 86, 91, climbing like an elevator toward life instead than spiraling toward death. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator clicking its mechanical breath into the newly opened space. Caldwell's face moved through a sequence of colors, first the white of someone watching control slip away, then the mottled red of a man who'd just witnessed something that didn't fit inside his protocol cards. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The words, when they came, emerged like a man speaking from underwater. "You just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. That is absolutely prohibited. You're done. Terminated. Effective immediately." Natalie didn't respond to him. Her hands were securing the airway, her focus narrowed to Davis's vitals, her entire being concentrated on the work that actually mattered. This was the part where a lesser person would have hesitated. Would have second-guessed. Would have let authority rewrite the narrative, would have accepted the fiction that protocol mattered more than oxygen in the lungs of a man drowning on his own paralyzed body. But Natalie had learned a long time ago, under mortar fire and with her own leg bleeding out onto desert sand, that true authority wasn't a title. It wasn't a position or a protocol card or the ability to make threats. True authority was the ability to see what needed to happen and do it when everyone else was still reading instructions. Davis's color normalized. His eyes began tracking again, still terrified, still traumatized, but alive. Conscious. Breathing. A man who'd almost died because the wrong person was making decisions had just been saved because the right person stopped asking permission. But that wasn't the worst part of what Caldwell had just set in motion. Caldwell moved like a man conducting a symphony of precision. Within the hour, precisely 54 minutes, the nurses would later document, the infrastructure of Natalie's employment began collapsing with surgical efficiency. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten again. He simply made decisions, and decisions were his domain. Davis was transferred to the West Wing, room 4127, a floor Natalie never worked, a transfer code entered into the system with a clinical justification. Psychiatric evaluation protocols require continuity of care with primary admitting physician. True enough. Untraceable enough. The bed that had held him 3 corridors from the trauma station now sat in a ward where she had no clearance, no reason, no path. Her schedule shifted next. The tablet in the break room updated at 2:17 p.m., and by 2:45, every trauma rotation had been reassigned. Night shifts pulled forward. Day shifts compressed. She'd work supply inventory, medication reconciliation, floor rounds, tasks designed for competence, not crisis. Tasks where no one would die if she didn't act. Tasks where she couldn't save anyone even if she wanted to. The ICU restriction came as a formal email from Caldwell's office, temporary access suspension pending review of credentials and protocol adherence. Effective immediately. Ms. Hayes will submit to retraining before clearance restoration. Temporary. A word meant to sound procedural. A word that could last forever. But those were structural moves. The real work happened on the phone. Caldwell locked himself in his office on the 3rd floor, and through the glass wall, Natalie watched him make 3 calls in succession, each one deliberate, each one rehearsed in the posture of a man who'd made such calls 100 times before. His power wasn't in his fists. His power was in his ability to describe a situation to the right people in the right way. The first call went to Gerald Morrison, the hospital board's financial chair, a man with commercial real estate holdings and a $400,000 annual consulting contract with Sacred Heart's Expansion Committee. Caldwell's voice came low and measured through the door. "Gerald, I need to inform you of a patient safety incident. A nurse without surgical credentials performed an unauthorized emergency procedure on a sedated patient. Improper technique. Unsterile field. This opens us to significant liability. We're looking at either six-figure settlements or an insurance exclusion that torpedoes our trauma designation. The second call went to Patricia Chen, the chief nursing officer, a woman who'd built her reputation on regulatory compliance and accreditation standards. Patricia, we have a protocol violation requiring immediate documentation. A registered nurse exceeded scope of practice, performed surgical intervention without physician supervision, and potentially contaminated a sterile field during an active code. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending investigation. We need to move fast to demonstrate we took decisive action. Otherwise, the Board of Nursing gets involved. The third call went to a number Natalie didn't recognize, but Caldwell's tone shifted, more deferential, more careful. Yes, sir. I wanted to personally inform you of the situation. Yes, one of my staff. A rogue nurse, frankly. Performing unauthorized surgical procedures, endangering patient safety, operating outside her scope. I've taken immediate action to contain the risk. No, I don't believe she's a threat to patient safety if properly supervised. But the incident itself demonstrates poor judgment. Whoever answered on the other end said something that made Caldwell's jaw tighten. He listened for nearly a minute without speaking. Then, understood, sir. Thank you for your guidance. He hung up, and something in his posture changed. His shoulders dropped slightly. The conversation had been approved. The vector had been established. Now it was just execution. Security arrived at 4:33 p.m. Not threatening, not aggressive, just two men in navy blazers with the apologetic expressions of people performing an unpleasant duty. They found Natalie at Davis's bedside in the West Wing, where she'd transferred herself on the pretense of a general patient check, where she'd been standing beside his bed for 8 minutes watching his breathing normalize, watching the monitors show what she'd already known, that he would live because she'd understood, in the fraction of a second when Caldwell froze, what needed to happen. Davis's eyes opened when the security guards approached. His hand moved, fingers reaching across the bed rail, and in that gesture was something she couldn't name, gratitude or recognition or the primitive understanding that she'd pulled him back from a place most people never recover from. Miss Hayes, we need you to come with us, please. She nodded and turned to leave, and as she turned, Davis's arm extended, his sleeve riding up his forearm, the cotton fabric falling back to reveal the tattoo beneath. It was small, roughly 2 inches across, the kind of mark that could be hidden easily but rarely was by men who'd earned it. The insignia of the 3rd Battalion Special Forces Medical Unit. The patch that had been sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one she'd worn the day the IED hit Sangin. Her breath caught. Corporal Davis. Of course. Corporal Davis, who'd taken shrapnel to the shoulder while she applied a tourniquet to the leg of Sergeant Chen. Corporal Davis, who'd been conscious enough to crack a joke about her bedside manner while she performed a field thoracotomy with a blade that had been a combat knife seconds before. Corporal Davis, who'd asked her name and she'd given him her first name only, which he'd shortened, which had become how his entire unit referred to her in the dark hours before the medevac helicopters arrived. The security guards moved closer, sensing her hesitation. Davis's hand fell, his arm dropping as they guided her away, and she didn't look back because looking back would be a luxury she couldn't afford. The mask had to hold. The composure had to stay intact. She was just a nurse leaving her shift, not a major watching her pass reach across a bed rail and pull her identity into the light. Her termination letter arrived by hospital courier at 6:22 p.m., delivered to the front security desk, forwarded to her personal address because Caldwell had already removed her access badge. The envelope was manila, the letterhead embossed, the language precise, effective immediately. Your employment with Sacred Heart Medical Center is terminated for gross violation of hospital protocols, insubordination, and unauthorized performance of surgical procedures. Your final paycheck, less accrued deductions and unpaid obligations, will be mailed to the address on file. Please return all hospital property to Human Resources within 48 hours. Gross violation. Insubordination. Unauthorized. Not thank you for saving a life. Not we appreciate your quick thinking. Not even we're sorry it had to end this way. She sat in her apartment at 8:13 p.m. with the letter on her kitchen table, and the silence of her life without a uniform felt different than it had 7 years ago when she'd arrived in Jacksonville. 7 years ago, the silence had felt like freedom. Now it felt like erasure. But she couldn't stay in the apartment. The walls were too small. So she drove back to Sacred Heart, to the basement level, to the laundry facility where she'd spent her nights rotating between rotation schedules and inventory counts. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, and the smell of industrial bleach cut through the air like a blade. She went to the locker where her clean scrubs hung, 7 sets, all issued by the hospital, all stamped with property markings on the back. She took them down and moved to the folding table, and without thinking about it, muscle memory took over. She folded each set with the precision she'd once used on her dress uniform in the barracks of Fort Bragg, 13 years ago, when she'd been someone different, someone with a rank and a unit and a future. She creased the sleeves, smoothed the collars, aligned the front so they lay perfectly flat. Each fold was exact. Each movement was deliberate. And with each completed set, she felt something inside her compartmentalize, the way soldiers compartmentalize, the way people who've learned to survive in compartments learn to function when everything else is falling away. The hospital had taken the title. Caldwell had taken the opportunity. The patient had taken the only thing that mattered, her skill, her expertise, her willingness to act. She placed the final folded set into the return bin and looked at her hands, stained with industrial detergent, creased at the knuckles from years of glove changes and compressions and procedures that left marks no amount of washing would remove. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that had performed surgery in a desert under fire. Hands that had been deemed rogue and dangerous and unauthorized. She picked up the empty locker tag and read her name printed on the laminate, Den Hayes, RN, EMP number 04781. She removed it, placed it on the shelf, and walked out through the basement exit, her limp more pronounced in the fluorescent silence, more noticeable now that she wasn't trying to hide it, more visible now that she had nothing left to prove to anyone in this building. The parking lot was dark. The rain had stopped. And somewhere in the west wing of Sacred Heart, a patient with her unit's tattoo was breathing because she'd chosen to act, and because of that choice, everything she'd built in Jacksonville for the past 3 years had just collapsed. 2 days. That's all it took for the world to find out what Dr. Caldwell had tried to bury. Natalie was sitting in her apartment at 6:19 a.m. on a Wednesday, coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter, when 3 black SUVs pulled up outside. She didn't move. She'd been trained to recognize the sound of official arrival, the particular way vehicle doors close in unison, the discipline of footsteps on concrete. Not police. Not hospital security. The precision was military. The knock on her door was loud enough for the neighbors in 4B and 4D to hear. Not a request. Not a courtesy. A command delivered through oaken hinges. She opened it to find a Navy SEAL team leader in dress blues, the creases sharp enough to cut paper. His collar device caught the morning light. Behind him, 2 junior enlisted in full uniform stood at parade rest. Major Natalie Hayes. His voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She didn't answer. She stepped aside and let them in. The escort to Sacred Heart took 14 minutes. Natalie sat in the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 operators in dress uniform, watching Jacksonville pass through the tinted windows. The city looked different now. Foreign. She'd walked these streets for 3 years thinking she was invisible, and in 72 hours she'd become the most visible person in it. Sacred Heart's main entrance had press vans already positioned. News crews. Local station logos. The SUVs pulled to the loading dock and cut the visibility off. The team leader, his name tag read Commander Mitchell, Task Force 160, gestured for her to follow. She moved like she still owned the place, despite the termination letter that had declared her a liability 28 hours ago. The board conference room was on the 4th floor. The elevator ride up felt like ascending in a pressure chamber. Mitchell didn't speak. Neither did she. The doors opened to find hospital administration already assembled. The chief of staff sat at the head of the table. The CFO. 3 board members including the one Caldwell had called personally about Natalie being a threat to chain of command. The legal team. Security. And standing at the back in his white coat like he still belonged there, Dr. Caldwell, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of a document he'd prepared, no doubt some narrative about protocol violations and insubordination. Mitchell walked to the center of the room like he was addressing a room full of privates who'd just failed inspection. "I'm Commander Jackson Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Task Force 160. I'm here to speak about Major Natalie Hayes, who was terminated from employment at this facility on grounds of unauthorized medical intervention." He paused. The fluorescent lights hummed. "That's incorrect. Major Hayes was fired for saving a life. And for that, you need to understand who you just fired." He opened a folder. Military-grade paper. Official seals. Major Natalie Hayes completed 3 combat deployments in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. She commanded a forward surgical team in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, where she performed emergency field surgery under direct fire with 0 fatality rate. Mitchell's voice didn't rise or modulate. It just carried. In 2016, her unit came under ambush while conducting medical evacuation. Taliban insurgents opened fire at 400 meters. Major Hayes continued the amputation procedure on a soldier whose leg had been crushed by an IED while taking shrapnel rounds that fractured 2 ribs and her left femur. Natalie watched Dr. Caldwell's face drain of color. The citation reads, "For heroic service under fire, Major Hayes is awarded the Purple Heart." That's one. Mitchell let the silence settle like dust. Next one, Bronze Star with Valor. Awarded for 3 separate combat actions in which she maintained field surgical capability under sustained enemy fire while treating casualties that exceeded available resources. She treated 14 patients in a 6-hour engagement. 12 survived. Only Major Hayes' presence made that possible. The board member Caldwell had leaned back in his chair. His hands folded on the table. And finally, Mitchell continued, turning the final page with deliberate slowness, for the rescue operation conducted on June 12, 2013, in which Major Hayes led her team through a minefield to extract 12 soldiers pinned down by Taliban forces, extracting every single one alive. Major Natalie Hayes was decorated with the Silver Star. That's the nation's 3rd highest military decoration. She earned it before you hired her. Mitchell closed the folder. The sound was louder than it should have been. 2 days ago, she performed a field cricothyrotomy on a patient in acute airway distress while your chief of surgery froze. That technique saved the patient's life. The same patient who is Corporal Davis, one of the 12 men she carried out of Sangin 7 years ago. Dr. Caldwell made a sound. Not quite a word. Something between a protest and a whimper. The chief of staff looked directly at Caldwell with the expression of someone who'd just been shown evidence of his daughter's involvement in a crime he'd helped cover up. "Doctor, I'd like you to leave the room. I need to explain." "Leave." Caldwell's hand trembled as he reached for the table. He steadied it. Muscle memory from decades of authority. It didn't help. He walked out, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a cell lock. What happened next came in pieces, delivered by Mitchell with the precision of an after-action report. The security footage that the hospital IT manager, a former Marine named Ellison, had preserved instead of deleted when Caldwell requested it. The video showed everything. Caldwell during the code blue, standing at the wall reviewing protocols while Natalie moved. The emergency crick kit being opened. The blade moving with absolute confidence. The immediate post-event deletion requests that Caldwell made to the IT department. The 3 phone calls to board members, each one recorded, each one containing false statements about Natalie's qualifications and her actions. Ellison had documented everything. Timestamps. Metadata. He'd reported it to the medical board's investigation team before sunrise. The chief of staff leaned forward. The medical board just issued a preliminary suspension on Dr. Caldwell's license pending formal investigation. That's effective immediately. We're cooperating fully. She looked at Natalie directly for the first time. Your termination is reversed. Your employment record will reflect medical leave status retroactive to your last shift. There will be a formal apology in writing from this hospital, and we're prepared to discuss appropriate compensation. One of the lawyers started talking about severance numbers. Natalie stopped listening. Mitchell's radio crackled. A voice that sounded young and urgent came through. "Sir, we have Corporal Davis. He's asking for Major Hayes." Natalie's chin moved forward just slightly. That was all. Not even a nod. A flinch that came and went so fast only someone trained to read it would notice it had happened. They wheeled Davis in from the VA wing where he'd been transferred the day after Caldwell's termination. He was in a hospital wheelchair, his left arm in a sling for physical therapy. The seizure had caused secondary injuries, soft tissue trauma from the convulsions, a mild aspiration pneumonia that the VA was treating. But his eyes were clear when he looked at her, and his mouth moved, working at forming shapes that his damaged vocal cords had to battle to produce. He lifted his right hand and made a gesture that looked like it took everything he had. A slow thumbs up. A smile that was almost whole. Natalie stood there while the room watched her, and the only thing she did was nod very slightly, the kind of nod that a superior officer gives a soldier who has just reported in after a long deployment. "I'm going on break," she said quietly, and it came out with the precision of someone who'd just given an order to a field team under fire. Mitchell made a sound that might have been a laugh if Navy SEAL commanders actually laughed. The medical board's formal investigation took 6 weeks. Dr. Caldwell's attorney advised him to resign quietly. He refused. He tried to fight it with the same institutional power that had protected him for 28 years, calls to donors, suggestions that this was a witch hunt, claims that he was being persecuted for maintaining standards. The donors, it turned out, didn't want to be associated with someone who'd fired a decorated combat veteran for saving a life while that veteran's story was already circulating in every major news outlet. The Jacksonville Times had run a front-page feature, "Decorated War Hero Fired for Saving Veteran's Life." The local NPR station picked it up. Then national news. Then military media ran the story as a sidebar to a larger piece about combat-induced PTSD and physician burnout. By week 4, Caldwell's hands were shaking visibly during board meetings. By week 6, the state medical board had issued its final finding, revocation of medical license pending formal review hearing, but with recommendation against reinstatement. The hospital's legal team settled with Natalie for a figure that would have bought a house outright. She donated half of it to the Veterans Medical Crisis Fund and took a position directing the new program at the VA hospital across town. Caldwell sold his house in the Riverside Historic District. His wife filed for separation. The country club that had hosted his annual fundraiser sent him a letter informing him that his membership was no longer active. He found work at a supplemental health insurance company in a strip mall on San Marco Avenue, between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, sitting at a folding table in a dress shirt that no longer fit him quite right, his hand still shaking as he handed out brochures to veterans and their families who learned to avoid eye contact. 6 months after her termination, Natalie stood in the Russell Senate office building wearing a simple navy suit. Not her dress uniform. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago, that some victories required civilian clothes. The citation was read by a deputy director from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Major Natalie Hayes, recognized for civilian heroism in medical emergency response, for treating combat trauma in both military and civilian contexts, and for the specific action of field emergency surgery performed without authorization because protocol would have resulted in death. Corporal Davis was in the audience in his wheelchair. He'd been in VA speech therapy for 5 months. His damaged vocal cords were healing slowly, but they were healing. He could whisper full sentences now, could participate in group therapy without the whiteboard. When they called Natalie's name, he managed to smile, and the smile was whole. The commendation medal hung from a ribbon around her neck. She touched it once, then folded her hands and waited for the flash photography to stop. After the ceremony, she visited Davis at the VA Rehabilitation Center where she was now volunteering 3 days a week, blending her military trauma expertise with civilian care training. She declined the Chief of Staff's offer to make her Sacred Heart's new head of trauma surgery. Instead, she'd chosen this 8 hours a week of direct patient care with veterans whose injuries ranged from the physical to the psychological to the invisible spaces where both existed at once. Davis was sitting by the window when she entered his room. His wheelchair was positioned toward the light. On the wall beside his bed was a frame, and inside the frame was a faded unit patch, the one from the inside of her jacket lining, the one he'd seen when she'd draped it over him during the seizure, the one that had told him everything he needed to know. She sat beside him. He reached out with his stronger hand and gripped her wrist. "Finally," he whispered. "Home, Major." She squeezed back, her eyes on the patch, on the unit designation that meant 12 soldiers and 1 medic had walked out of Sangin alive, on the rank insignia that meant she'd never been invisible, only waiting. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Ellison at IT, coffee. She typed back, "Tomorrow. 7 a.m. On her way out of the facility, she passed the bulletin board near the main entrance. A new hospital policy had been posted system-wide, Combat-Informed Trauma Care Protocol, Hayes Standard. The protocol detailed decision trees for trauma assessment that prioritized patient autonomy and trauma-informed intervention. Below it, someone, a nurse named Reeves who worked the trauma bay, had handwritten her closing words from the award ceremony acceptance speech, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Across town, in a strip mall where the fluorescent lights flickered with irregular timing, Dr. Caldwell looked up from his folding table as a veteran in a VA wheelchair passed by without slowing down. The veteran didn't make eye contact. Nobody did anymore. Caldwell watched him roll past toward the tax office next door, and somewhere in the ventilation system above, something hummed like the sound of a helicopter in the distance, getting closer, then fading, then never quite gone. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And I'm always curious, drop a comment and tell us if you're watching from a big city or a small town. Now let's continue the story.